The Australian Grand Prix should simply have been the beginning of a new era in Formula One, but it ended up causing a real storm within the paddock. What happened in Melbourne not only left a chaotic race, but also technical suspicions, opposing teams, and brutal pressure on the FIA that is now forced to intervene. Mercedes dominated the race with a double that seemed impeccable, but a few hours after the finish, everything changed when several teams presented a technical dossier requesting a formal investigation into its engine and its strange behavior on the track. Subscribe to continue uploading more of this type of content now, if we continue. The telemetry data set off all the alarms because the German car seemed capable of sustaining a display of electrical power that was practically impossible under the limitations of the new regulations, something that has unleashed a technical war that could redefine the championship from a first race. Meanwhile, drivers have also begun to express their frustration with extremely complex cars to manage, with energy problems, unpredictable race situations, and a regulation that some consider full of gray areas that certain teams could be exploiting. Now the question that the entire paddock is asking is disturbing. Have we simply seen a complicated race? Or are we facing the first major technical scandal of the new era of Formula One? Because if suspicions are confirmed, the FIA could face one of the most delicate decisions in recent years. The Australian Grand Prix should have been a simple season opener, the starting point of a new stage for Formula One with the release of the 2026 technical regulations. For months, this new era had been talked about as a revolution that promised more efficient cars, new power units, and even more intense competition between the teams. However, what happened in Melbourne ended up being something completely different. Instead of opening a season with enthusiasm, the race opened a huge rift within the paddock, generating an explosive mix of political tension, technical suspicions, and open criticism of the FIA. What began as a complicated race ended up becoming the trigger for a crisis that now threatens to escalate to much greater levels within the championship. From the first moments of the weekend, it was already clear that something was not working normally. The new cars proved extremely difficult to manage, especially due to the way in which the regulations forced the drivers to manage the energy of the hybrid system throughout the race. Some cars seemed to lose performance at unexpected times, others had difficulty maintaining electric deployment on the straights, and several drivers began to complain that the driving had become much more unpredictable than they expected. The promise of a more balanced regulation was beginning to falter even before the traffic lights went out at the race. When Sunday finally arrived, the atmosphere was already filled with uncertainty. The Albert Park circuit was the scene of an extremely complicated race, with multiple incidents, moments of tension on the track, and strategies conditioned by energy management. The teams were still trying to understand how to extract maximum performance from the new cars, while the drivers constantly struggled to maintain the balance between speed and energy consumption. This new landscape created unpredictable situations in which some cars looked competitive for a few laps and completely vulnerable shortly after. The general feeling was that no one still had full control of what was happening on the track. In the midst of this chaotic scenario, the first major protagonist of the weekend appeared: Mercedes. The German team achieved a convincing result with a double that placed George Russell at the top of the podium, followed by the young Kimi Antonelli. Apparently, the team had interpreted the new regulations better than anyone else and had found the key to maximizing the performance of its car in the new conditions. During the hours after the race, many thought that we were simply seeing the beginning of a new era dominated by Mercedes, a repetition of what the team had already achieved in other eras of Formula One. But that perception soon changed radically. While the teams were analyzing the race data, signs began to appear that aroused suspicion within the paddock. Engineers from several teams detected strange behavior in the telemetry of the Mercedes car, especially in the way it deployed the electrical energy of the hybrid system. In theory, the regulation establishes very clear limits on the amount of electrical power that can be used and for how long this deployment can be maintained on the straights. However, according to preliminary analyses, the German car seemed capable of sustaining that maximum level of power for longer stretches than should be possible. That immediately set off alarms among the rivals. What followed was an immediate reaction within the paddock. Several teams began to share information and compare telemetry data to try to understand what was happening. Little by little, the suspicion began to form that Mercedes could be using some technical solution that exploited a gray area in the regulations. In Formula One, these types of situations are not new. Throughout history, many teams have found ingenious ways to interpret the rules to gain competitive advantage. But when those interpretations seem too aggressive, tensions between teams can escalate quickly. And that's exactly what started happening after the Australian Grand Prix. In a matter of hours, the atmosphere inside the paddock changed completely. What initially seemed like a sporting triumph began to become the center of a technical dispute involving several of the most powerful teams on the grid. Ferrari, Red Bull, Ford, Audi, and other teams began discussing the possibility of filing a formal protest with the FIA. The main suspicion revolved around the possibility that Mercedes had found a method to optimize the thermal behavior of its engine and thus obtain superior performance during the race. If that theory were confirmed, the result of the Australian Grand Prix could be just the beginning of a much larger controversy. But beyond the possible technical conflict, the real problem began to be something else. The 2026 regulation, which had been presented as the future of Formula One, was already generating deep doubts among drivers and teams. The difficulties in managing energy, the complexity of hybrid systems, and the appearance of possible regulatory loopholes made many within the paddock begin to wonder if the new regulations were really prepared to offer a fair and balanced championship. And if the first Grand Prix was already causing this level of controversy, no one knew to what extent the situation could escalate in the coming races. Only a few hours had passed since the end of the Australian Grand Prix when the situation within the paddock began to escalate to a completely unexpected level. What were initially simple technical suspicions quickly began to transform into a real war between teams. The engineers from several teams had been analyzing telemetry data all night, comparing top speeds, reviewing the energy behavior of the cars, and looking for any indication that could explain the superiority shown by Mercedes in Melbourne. And the deeper they dug into that data, the more questions arose. The focus of the controversy centered on a very specific point of the new regulation: the management of electrical energy within hybrid power units. In the new regulations, the MGUK system has a very clear limit on the power it can deploy, set at 350 kilowatts. In addition, the regulations also determine how long this energy display can be maintained throughout a lap. In theory, all teams should face the same restrictions, but according to the data collected during the race, the Mercedes car seemed to behave differently. Rivals found that the W17 was capable of sustaining that maximum level of electrical power during longer stretches of Albert Park Straights, something that was extremely difficult under the energy limitations of the new regulations. In other words, the German car seemed to maintain a constant power delivery at times when other teams had already exhausted their energy capacity. This difference was not only reflected in top speeds, but also in the way the car accelerated out of certain corners, giving Mercedes a clear advantage in several sectors of the circuit. The heart of this theory revolves around the engine's compression ratio. The regulation establishes that this ratio must not exceed the value of 16:1 when static technical tests are carried out that verify the legality of the power units. However, some engineers believe that Mercedes could have designed its engine so that when the system reaches temperatures close to 130 degrees during the race, the thermal expansion of certain components allows the effective compression ratio to increase to levels close to 18:1. If this hypothesis were correct, the Mercedes engine could generate more thermal efficiency and therefore release more useful energy to the hybrid system during acceleration phases. This would explain why the car seemed to have higher energy availability on the straights. Technically, it would be an extremely aggressive interpretation of the regulations. It would comply with the static controls carried out by the FIA, but in real race conditions it would work in a completely different way. The reaction of the rivals was immediate. Ferrari, Red Bull, Ford, Audi, and other manufacturers began to coordinate to prepare a technical dossier that would be presented to the FIA. This document brought together telemetry data, speed comparisons, energy behavior analysis, and various hypotheses about how the Mercedes engine system could be working. Inside the paddock, there was talk of a nuclear report, an expression that reflects the extent to which the teams were convinced that something strange was happening. From that moment on, the atmosphere within Formula One became extremely tense. Conversations in motorhomes, garages, and technical meetings stopped revolving around race strategy or aerodynamic development. Now everyone was talking about the same thing: the Mercedes engine. Some engineers argued that the team had simply done a brilliant job interpreting the regulations better than anyone else. Others, however, considered that if the suspicions were true, it would be a maneuver that dangerously crossed the line between what was legal and what was prohibited. Meanwhile, the FIA found itself in an extremely delicate position. If the Federation decided to open a formal investigation against Mercedes, the championship could become embroiled in a controversy that would directly affect the result of the first race. But if he ignored the accusations, he risked the rest of the teams losing confidence in the body's ability to enforce the regulations. In both cases, the pressure on the FIA began to increase brutally. And the most worrying thing is that this conflict not only affected the result of a race, but the future of the entire championship. If Mercedes' system was considered legal, other manufacturers would be forced to develop similar solutions as soon as possible. But if it was finally proven to violate the spirit of the regulations, Formula One would face one of the most important technical controversies in recent years. The only thing that was clear at that moment was that the storm was just beginning. And the big question that remains in the air is disturbing. Have we simply witnessed a chaotic race at the beginning of the season, or are we facing the first major conflict that will define the new era of Formula One? Because if the history of this sport has taught us anything, is that when the technical wars begin, the real championship is just beginning. Subscribe to continue uploading more of that content. Now you really think about all this.